Welcome back to the studio. It's another scorcher today, but we're going to continue on. This isn't really a three-part series, but I am doing 3 videos using one quilt. I recently released a video called Long Arm Loading 101 or something to that effect. It's basically for beginners, just some tips about how to load a quilt onto the long arm machine. Today what we're going to be doing, since I have the quilt loaded onto the machine and ready to go, I'm going to show how to baste a quilt. And the purpose of this basting is not the edges, but basic overall basting, and it would be for people who might want to do hand quilting and they want to thread baste their whole quilt and utilize the services of a long armer. But also it could be used for when you're going to be doing some kind of quilting that may be very heavy and very intricate, digital quilting, and you need all the components to line up. What I'm going to do is baste the quilt about somewhere between 4 and 6 inches. I haven't decided yet. A grid or a diagonal, something to stabilize the whole surface of the quilt. I'll just roll the whole thing out and get it quilted, and then I can cut off the excess batting at the bottom and re-roll it. I'm going to be using a water-soluble thread today. The thread is called Perish, and I was going to see if I could tell you who it was made by, but I'm sure if you looked up the word Perish thread, you'd be able to find it quickly enough. I'm going to be using this water-soluble thread in both the bobbin and in the top of the machine, so when the quilt is finished, you could either bind it and wash it or just spritz it with a spray bottle, and the thread will completely dissolve, which would eliminate the need for removing all of the thread basting. Sometimes when you're sewing, you remove it as you go, but this won't require that. The reason that I'm doing this particular quilt with the basting is because I'm going to be using a whole cloth design on the quilt, and the design will require that several rows align up perfectly once the quilt is quilted. The basting will help prevent some of the shrinkage from the stitching of the design on the quilt. So that's the thought process anyway. As I said, the quilt is already loaded. As I said in the previous video, I know some people are afraid their past will catch up with them, but I'm actually trying to catch up with my past. This quilt top is easily 17 to 20 years old. I moved about 17 years ago, and it was finished before that by a couple years at least. So I'm trying to get caught up on some of the old projects I had. I still enjoy the quilt. It's a beautiful quilt, primarily green, which is one of my all-time favorite colors, and it also has a variety of oriental fabrics in it. So I'm looking forward to having it quilted. And I chose a really beautiful whole cloth design, and that will be in a separate video, but the design I'm selecting is called Heather from Urban Elements. And so that'll be the next video. So I'm going to turn the camera around and get the machine loaded with the Perish thread. I'm also going to load some bobbins. And this is just something that I do. Whenever I'm using something specific like this, I always get 2 spools. I don't like to unthread my machine in the middle of the process and worry if I've got the machine threaded. Once I got it going, I want to keep going. So I always get 2 spools of thread, one for the bobbin winder, one for the machine. And it's always nice in case you underestimate how much you need just to have that extra spool. So I'm going to go ahead and get the camera moved, and we can get started on basting a quilt. I have the long arm machine turned on. I'm going to put it on BSR 3, and BSR 3 has 3 different stitch per inch settings. You could even set your own on the Bernina, but I'm just going to leave it on the one that I usually use, number 2. And I also have my IntelliQuilter on. I don't necessarily need the IntelliQuilter to baste a quilt, but the IntelliQuilter does have channel locks built into the system. So if I went into manual mode, I can either turn on horizontal or vertical locks so that I can get straight rows. Now for basting, it isn't absolutely essential that I had straight rows, but it looks better. Also, I have my water-soluble thread loaded onto the machine and in the bobbin. It loads just exactly as it normally would, with one exception. If you are one of those people that has the habit of sticking the thread in your mouth just before you thread the needle, you'll want to avoid that step, because the thread will just melt in your mouth. And not melt in your mouth good, it will just disappear. So we have the quilt ready to baste. The level of basting that you're going to use, the amount of basting, is really going to come down to what the next step is. If you were doing this for somebody, you might ask them how heavily they wanted it basted. I would also ask them if they wanted cotton, polyester, or water-soluble thread basting. Humidity may be a factor for the water-soluble thread. Also, when your thread's not in use, I would put water-soluble thread in a little Ziploc baggie just to keep it safe. So I have my machine set up. I'm just going to go over to the left-hand side, and I'm going to start. Now I've already thread basted the top of the quilt, but I'm going to go over to, no, I'm going to skip that. I'm going to go down about 5 or 6 inches, and I'm actually going to get a measure. I'm not going to use the ruler against the machine, I'm just going to use it as a test. So it looks like what I'm thinking is about a 4 or 5 inch quantity of strip, area between the strip. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up my bobbin thread, and then I'm going to start basting. But I do have to add my side tension to both sides. I haven't done that yet, and then we'll go ahead and get started. I'm turning on my horizontal lock, which will keep me in a fairly straight line. The basting, I'm certainly going to do horizontal lines across the entire quilt, about every 4 or 5 inches. I'm also going to come back and do some horizontal lines and then roll up the quilt and do more. And because this pattern is a little bit dense, I might also be doing some diagonal lines. I've heard some people baste horizontal, vertical, and diagonal to give you the best stabilization. Slow and steady wins the race here. And I've already, I think my thread came out of the bobbin, so I'm going to start, I got all the way to here. I'm going to go ahead and fix the bobbin and we'll start again. But this often happens if I fill up my bobbin too much. It comes unthreaded for a few times until the spool gets down a little bit, and then it works fine. I'm going to turn off my horizontal lock and come down about 4 or 5 inches. The exact measurement doesn't really matter because I'm not using this to design my quilt in any way. I'm just using it to baste all the layers together. One of the things that I read all of the time on Facebook, on different posts, people are always asking how much do they charge? How much do you charge for long-arm quilting? How much do you charge for custom quilting? How much do you charge for binding? How much do you charge to baste a quilt? And people always just talk about a rate, like a square inch, how much they charge per square inch. And the square inch is basically the length times the width. So if you had a 12 by 12 inches, that's 144 square inches. And then they multiply that out. Some people charge 1.5 cents per square inch. Some people charge 2 cents per square inch. Some people charge 3 cents per square inch. And the things that never get discussed are your ability, your creativity, and most importantly, the cost of all of your equipment. Now, somebody may have inherited a machine, or somebody may have bought them a machine as a present, and they don't have to factor those things in. But for most of the people in the world, and for any other kind of business, you have to factor in the cost of doing business, which is the cost of this machine. In my case, the IntelliQuilter. Are you providing batting? Are you providing thread? Do you have to pay additional insurance, either on your homeowner's insurance to cover the equipment, or do you have to cover, have a special business location? Do you have rent? Do you have employees? All of these things have to have an impact on your machine and how long it takes to pay off your equipment. So I think people should really examine how much they've invested into their craft and what it is they're providing. The funny thing about most services have increased over the years in how much they charge to have something done. Long-arm quilting has actually decreased. It used to be a solid 2 inches per square inch, and now in many places it's 1.5 inches or an inch, excuse me, a penny or a half a penny per square inch. And I just think it's phenomenal that we're undermining ourselves by charging less and less and less for our services. I don't want to quilt for hire so much that I'm willing to undercut other people in the business. I don't want to give my time away or my talent away. So I would just urge some of you to think about how much time you're investing in the money before you come up with the price. I'm going to go ahead and keep basting this quilt. You can see I'm sweating today because it's so hot. I'm also going to turn my dehumidifier on because I am using water-soluble thread and it's very humid. So let's get back to it. So far I have 4 rows. They're varying sizes of horizontal basting. Now I'm going to go back and do some horizontal while I still have this piece of the quilt in the throat space. So I'm just going to come over some quantity. I'm going to turn on my vertical lock this time. And now I'm just going to do some straight lines. And I have a thread break. I'm going to keep making progress on this quilt. Making little checkerboard designs of the basting. Even if I have to overlap some of my previous basting lines, I'm fine with that. This is sandwiching down all 3 layers of, well, in my case, all 4 layers of the fabric. I have the 2 front and back, and I have the 2 layers of batting. sometimes the channel locks just slow you down, and because this is not going to be in the final design, I'm just going to go ahead and zip through more of the basting without using the channel locks. I have the top 18 or 19 inches of the quilt basted. This is a 60-inch quilt, so I'm approximately 1/3 done. I have the needle down in my basting, and I already pulled out my side tension clamps. So I'm going to go ahead and roll up the quilt and get ready to do the next section of the basting. At this point, I just want to check the batting to make sure that the batting is feeding properly. I don't have any big wrinkles. With the Bernina, you can reach right under the quilt to get at the batting. And so I just want to make sure that everything is lining up straight. And then we can go ahead and drop down. And straighten out the quilt. And after we get the tension clamps and the side clamps done, we can get back to basting the next section. Because I am at the center of the quilt, and the next process I'm going to do is a whole cloth quilt that is supposed to be constructed from the center out, I'm going to go ahead and stabilize this center star area, which will be the center of the quilt, and do it a little bit differently than the grid that I was doing on the outside. It's always a good idea to ask the customer or to decide for yourself what you're going to be doing with the quilting. That way it'll help inform the way that you decide to grid or baste your quilt. So I'm just going to be doing some of the outline of the stars, some of these blocks, and move out that way and just see what difference that might make in the end process of the basting. It is a little bit of a learning function process. I also have changed to a different basting stitch. I'm going to see how if I like that one better than BSR2. BSR4 is a heavier basting function, which is what I kind of wanted. The stitches to be a little bit closer. I don't really change my BSR function that often, so I did not have them memorized. I'll bring the camera a little bit closer so you can see what I'm doing. But you'll see that I'm not stitching in the ditch per se, because this is all going to be washed away or be taken out. So I don't have to be exact, but it does help to stabilize the quilt. Essentially, it would look like I was stitching in the ditch, but I don't really have to be that close. And I managed to break the thread again. I imagine that this water-soluble thread is a little bit thin. I've done some of the outlining of the blocks. I'm just going to do some diagonal zigzag as an additional basting style. But then I'm going to keep going around building this concentric basting function as I go. I've got most of the center done. And it just seems if I go too fast with that basting, I break this thin thread. Now you certainly could use cotton or polyester thread here, but that would just mean that you're going to have to pull all of these threads out either as you're sewing or at the end. Well, I got almost all of the quilt basted, but then my tension spring popped out again. So that means the tension disc is going to have to come off and go to the service center. But I have enough done to complete the video. The things that I wanted to reiterate, number one, what kind of thread do you want to use? That's going to depend on the person that's going to quilt the finished piece. I would not probably recommend water-soluble thread for somebody who is going to be working on hand quilting something over the next year or two because of humidity. I used it on here because I had intended to finish this quilt next week on my next sewing day. That may not be possible now with the spring being gone. So if it's for the long haul, probably cotton. It's also nice if you know what the quilter is going to do with the quilting pattern, because then you could modify your grid based on that. The top and bottom of my quilt here, I used a grid, but in the center where the medallion is going to start, I stabilized it a little heavier, and I went around a lot of the components in the actual quilt piecing. In the end, it doesn't matter because all of that's going to come out. It doesn't look very neat necessarily. I mean, you could make yours perfectly neat if you wanted to, but again, it's all going to come out in the end. So I would recommend cotton or poly cotton if you're going to haul for the long haul. If it's somebody that's going to be using it on a domestic machine, probably you could do the water soluble if you thought they were going to do it quickly. If not, I probably would go again with the cotton or one of the polyester threads. The nice thing about basting the quilt, you don't have to have all of the safety pins in it, so it eliminates all of that weight, and also those loops of the safety pin aren't getting caught on everything like the domestic sewing machine, or scratching somebody who's hand quilting or getting caught in the hoop. So for that reason, I also would recommend the thread basting. And again, I'm excited about this water soluble because it should eliminate me having to do anything once it's finished. I can just go ahead and put the binding on it and either spritz it with water or actually wash it. But again, this quilt is going to be used for another tutorial. I'm going to be doing a digital whole cloth quilt, hopefully starting from the center and working out. And that necessitated me needing to have it basted. The basting helps eliminate shrinkage so that when I do the digital pattern, the pattern lines up with itself as it was intended to. Most patterns do include a little bit of shrink in the design for the digital computerized system, but if you have a lot of shrink, it could cause problems. So that is it on my basting tutorial. You can certainly leave comments and let me know if you baste your quilts, if you've ever basted a quilt, why you do it, if it's for customers, or any tips that you might have as well that other people will read in the comments section. So thanks for stopping by the studio again today. It's very hot here. I don't have the AC on so that you don't hear that in the background, but I do have the dehumidifier on just to protect my thread, which is making it hotter. So I will see you again next time here in the studio, and until then, take care of each other.